You know, these guys have been chomping at the bit because they were listening to the last discussion, and we've been talking about this idea of what in this ecosystem allows for the kind of developments that are happening here. What in this ecosystem leads to the magic of what is happening in so many therapies today. I wonder, I'll start with you. What is it? I mean, what is this? What is the special thing about Boston, about Cambridge, about Kendall Square? What is happening here?
Well, it has to be a kind of a complicated answer only because an ecosystem by its nature takes a lot of things to keep together. That's why it's hard to build, and while it's fragile, we heard it said, at the same time, I do think that Boston has gotten to a stage where it has really advantages that's keeping this going. So I think it's in part courage, which comes from experience. This sector has been here for 30 years. In part comes from connections and the collaboration that we're doing, and certainly that's a huge part of this. It comes from a level of commitment from the players. This is not a short-term business, and I think in other areas where people have thought about life science the way they think about software innovation, people usually get disappointed because it really takes a significant long-term commitment to do this, and it takes capital.
Yeah, and on that point particularly, you know, we brought you here and we say, oh, this is the VC guy, and we all have a notion of who the VC guy is, right? He comes in, he's got a bunch of money, he's passing it out, it's all great, everybody loves him, it'd be nice to know. But it is different.
Yeah.
Your organization in particular is different in how you grow these businesses.
Well, I mean, I think that the life science innovation, particularly in the therapeutics area, is now being done partly in academia, partly in startups, partly in firms like ours where we have our own labs and we conceive our own underlying scientific advances that are designed to create completely new therapeutic paradigms. Companies like Moderna, companies like Seres, these are companies that, but for the internal innovations, wouldn't exist. These were not academic innovations. So it takes a lot of different, and certainly large companies are beginning to venture into saying, how can we play in the very early stage world?
Which brings us to these guys.
Exactly.
Because Yumanity is baby Groot, as we've said.
It's a sapling.
The sapling. And these, I see people watch crazy movies like I do, Guardians of the Galaxy movie. But you are, as you describe your own business, the sapling of.
Well, we're just getting started, and so there's so many interesting things to add on to what Noubar said about the ecosystem. So we typically think of it as a combination of academia, and Laurie did a brilliant job earlier this morning talking about that's really where the biology of these diseases gets elaborated, where we really are spending time on the biology. This actually represents the pull-through, if you will, of those findings, where we're able to take the basic biological understanding and apply the capital and the know-how, which Gilmore and I represent, to really begin identifying the therapies that will most effectively interact with the biology. So it can happen as companies grow, as Biogen has to becoming quite a leader in the field, or young companies like Yumanity that really sit somewhere right at the cusp of taking that biology that came from the Whitehead Institute, talking about the ecosystem. We're here because of science that's been evolving at the Whitehead Institute, and my recently deceased partner, Sue Lindquist. It's her life's work. And from the lab now through the chemistry efforts, the therapy efforts, and eventually we expect in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS to have new therapeutic discoveries that won't just improve the cognitive symptoms, but will actually, we hope, stop the progression of those diseases.
Can you just give me the Reader's Digest version of what Yumanity is looking at?
So we always talk about misfolded proteins, and this is very simple. Proteins, which we've all heard about in the body, we think of on the page of a textbook somewhere as being two-dimensional and flat. They're actually three-dimensional. And in order for proteins to function appropriately, they actually have a three-dimensional configuration. They fold, they turn, they're really three-dimensional structures. If those three-dimensional structures aren't folded properly, they malfunction. And these disorders, diabetes included, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's, Alzheimer's, they're all disorders of misfolded proteins. We've all heard about alpha-synuclein as a cause of Parkinson's. Alpha-synuclein is the misfolded culprit protein for Parkinson's. We've all heard about beta-amyloid. We think beta-amyloid is the misfolded culprit protein, or at least one of them, for Alzheimer's disease. We're unpacking the science behind what these misfolded proteins do in the cell and how the cells may malfunction as a result of misfolding, which leads to the symptoms and the deterioration for these neurodegenerative diseases.
And to pick up on that, and you also, at Biogen, are also approaching these questions about base and whatever else we can find to alleviate and to change the course of disease.
Yeah, and so Biogen has actually increased its focus on neurodegenerative diseases and neurologic diseases in general, but actually also embracing not just the big diseases, but the rare diseases, and has approached them using a sort of panoply or a multiplicity of approaches, which includes small molecules, or small chemically synthesized molecules, macromolecules, or biologically synthesized proteins, and actually also gone into newer areas such as synthetic pieces of DNA, such as antisense oligonucleotides. There is one thing I'd like to touch on as well regarding the ecosystem, because we talked about finance and financial investment, but I think another very important piece is the human investment. And one of the things that's extraordinarily attractive about Boston and this area of the country is the enormous amount of human talent. And I think that should not be diminished in consideration. Boston is a beacon for people who are interested in the biological sciences and has been certainly a capital of intellectual investigation for centuries. But over the last few decades, one of the things that really helps the companies here double down on their investments, take on very challenging problems, is the enormous pool of talent that's available coming through the universities. And
so that's what we were talking about just
Yeah.
before, this idea that, well, could this have happened anywhere else? Yes, I understand why
Yes.
perhaps it's happened here, but could you transplant this somewhere else?
I think that's a great question. I think there are a number of things that I've learned over the years that came together in Boston. There actually has been, first of all, there was, as I'm told, there was a massive, explosion of investment in the tech industry first before biotech, and that actually led to a foundation of investment expertise and risk appetite here in Boston. I think the universities then, when you think about the multiplicity of universities here and the discoveries that they have made over the last few decades, and speaking as a representative of a company that was one of the pioneers of biotech, that sort of combination of talent, scientific exploration, and the existing of the venture capital system here enabled us to actually come together.
As great as we think Boston, Cambridge is, and it is great,
Yes.
there are some iconic places for the biopharmaceutical industry. San Francisco and the Bay Area are arguably one of the birthplaces of this industry. Seattle's another great one, the suburban Washington area. New Jersey, of course, for the pharmaceutical end of that. Very different lineage and very different heritage. But what I think they all share in common are some of the features Gilmore is talking about. This unusual convening, if you will,
Confluence
of talent, of academic understanding of the biology, as we talked about, and then the capital to support all of that. We were talking a little bit about some of the statistics, and these are widely publicized, so I won't tell this audience anything it doesn't know, but somewhere around $2 billion or so to develop these new therapies.
So people have said it's the $2.6 billion pill.
Some people say 2.6 billion, but even if that number is wrong and we cut it in half, how many times will we make an investment of $1.5 billion for an uncertain outcome at the end of 8 to 10 years? That's quite an equation, and that's linked exactly to the conversation around value that Stephen talked about, to the conversation around price, reimbursement, and the regulatory aspects. None of these things exist separately. So that risk capital where Noubar has played a key role is important.
So one thing we haven't talked about that I do want to highlight, though, I think which does make Boston, and I agree completely, there's lots of places where innovation is happening. But I think one of the things that changed in the Boston area, and I give companies like Novartis and others in the big pharma space who moved in here, actually that changed the ecosystem completely. I've been in Boston with startups for 30 years. This is my 30th year. And what has changed dramatically is that as pharmaceutical companies moved in, and they started thinking about this not as the object of accidental business development, which is once in a while they go shopping for something they need and then that's it. That's not why they moved here. I think more and more they're beginning to create long-term linkages to the vast academic and startup community. Think of it almost as an innovation supply chain. People, large companies don't think of innovation and their dependency on it quite the way they think about buying the goods that go into their own products. But I think they should, because ultimately the pharma industry is more about innovation supply than it is about the ingredients they use to make their drugs. Otherwise they wouldn't have the margins they have. So how will they ensure the innovation supply? They used to think of their own R&D labs to do this. Now they realize that risk adjusted, they'd rather other people spend $10 billion and they just overpay for one of the output of that that happened to succeed. Right. To do that, you need to be in the community, you need to see the science develop, influence it. So I think in that regard, if you look at that dimension, Boston has a huge lead advantage. And the question is, how do we encourage those linkages, which could appear competitive, but actually are not over long times?
So you think the pharmaceutical companies were the accelerators?
I think the pharmaceutical companies made all of us in the startup community almost, or enabled us to think more boldly than what was happening before, where people were saying, if only I could just get one drug out of this company, I'm very happy as an investor. Now we have companies. Take this example, a company called Moderna that we've been involved with. Moderna announced at the JP Morgan conference that they have 12 drugs that are in clinical development. 5 of them have already gone into humans. That's a biotech company that's 5 years old. There was no way to do that unless they could forge partnerships with AstraZeneca, with Merck, with Alexion, with Vertex, just down the street from here. And they're not selling out their product pipeline. They've kept a lot of their products. So thinking about these linkages as a way to think, seamlessly from ideation all the way to impact on patients. What Tony mentioned is, if it costs $2 billion to take a drug out, how many can one company do? Well, it turns out that one company can do many in the earliest stages, provided that there is a win-win way to have more advanced late-stage companies take it all the way. And I think Biogen certainly has done a lot of that too.
Yeah, certainly at Biogen.
Yeah, so we've had experience in doing that. In fact, that many of our good experiences have been actually in partnering or identifying compounds or new technologies in other companies and then bringing it across the finishing line. And bringing across the finish line sounds maybe trivial, it's non-trivial. Designing large, pivotal studies that will meet the demands and requirements as they should of the regulatory authorities around the world, as well as demonstrating true value to patients and to the societies and governments and payers that are going to actually fund those is really important, and that's what we actually have done.
So since you initiated that part of the conversation, let me just dive over there, because I am, after all, a Washington person. And in the regulatory environment that we're talking about in the new administration and in this thinking, what are your cautions and concerns about and the notion of, is the environment too heavy-handed in its regulatory approach? Should we now be talking about pulling back on that, being focused further on safety but not so much on efficacy? What are the cautions that you offer to the new administration and to Washington in general about the future of the regulatory environment and what it does to stifle or create innovation?
So I'm just a simple physician. I always say that. I'm not a policymaker. But the things I would say carefully are, first of all, the use of medications or therapeutics is always about balancing efficacy and risk. There is no such thing as a medicine that actually doesn't have side effects, and one has to balance those two together. I think it's important that if you're going to take a risk with a compound as a patient, one should actually have a very clear understanding the efficacy is meaningful. With regard to the regulatory landscape, there is no doubt the FDA has been moving heaven and earth to try and actually streamline and be as efficient as possible, getting that balance of benefit risk correct. And actually, our most recent experience has actually been very positive with the FDA. We recently achieved approval for a compound Spinraza, a novel and first treatment for a lethal disease called spinal muscular atrophy. And in that case, the FDA worked really hard and basically approved the compound 4 months after we filed.
4 months.
4 months. So that is, I think that's a wonderful example of how the FDA, I'm speaking from the national point of view of the US, has actually really moved heaven and earth to be as efficient as possible while getting that risk balance of benefit and risk really optimal.
So, Tony, you agree? It's not that the FDA is being too heavy-handed and slow pokey?
No, I don't think so at all. I think that was the case 10 years ago, and we talked a little bit about this in the green room. 10 years ago, we were just sitting on the nexus of the Vioxx incident, if you will, where Vioxx was linked with heart attacks, and the FDA was a very different place. It became exquisitely conservative. So in this balance between the conversation of efficacy and safety, and benefit and risk, which are really different concepts, that FDA responded on the side of efficacy and safety. So our job is to keep unsafe therapies from Americans. Well, that's not the job of the FDA. The FDA has a responsibility to actually weigh the benefit and the risks. No therapy that I'm aware of has 0 side effects. So we have to figure out where the benefit is greater than the risk, and that's really the way the FDA has been recrafted. So this current administration actually invited a group of pharma CEOs to the White House 2 weeks ago and has made the statement that they're going to relax regulations to get drugs faster. We've had that experience as that pendulum swung back over the last 10 years of getting therapies, and Spinraza is a great example. 4 months was unheard of 10 years ago in terms of the approval cycle. So I'm not sure we need less regulatory oversight. We need smart regulatory oversight, but an FDA that's really focused on benefit and risk, not safety and efficacy, and we've got to be very, very thoughtful. You can swing the pendulum back too far the other side, focusing only on efficacy and actually have risks that outweigh the benefits. So we have to be very, very careful as we move forward here.
Yeah, it is the question about whether pharmaceutical companies become snake oil salesmen or
That's not what we want to do. We actually want to, I think what gets us up in the morning, what keeps us excited, is using novel, exciting biologies to make people's lives better and to try and get people back to a life that they desire. And that has been interrupted by a disease.
So what do we see, or if it's not a purely regulatory problem that drives more innovation, if that's not it, what is it that we need?
Well, I alluded to one solution. I do think, let me give you one suggestion. 67 years ago, the movie industry was made up of a few big studios. And they had to have their own stunt people, their own script writers, their own actors, their own everything. Today, the large studios basically participate in a set of alliances where the creative's separate, the actors are separate, and they provide money, they provide distribution, they provide the late stage development of the project, and that's where the large amount of money comes in. How did that happen? What happened is that they stopped kind of innovating after a while. They stopped having access to the best creative, and then they started thinking, how do I access it? So I think that's going to be an important thing. On the FDA matter, I fully agree that the solution is to actually have the FDA propose new ways to allow certain things that balance risk and reward, not to do it around the FDA. I totally think that concerns all of us in the industry, and in fact, some of us in the early stage community have actually started talking about what may be alternatives that the administration should consider that are FDA-centric. We have good examples. In the area of cancer, late stage cancer, what it takes to get a drug approved and to patients very early on is altogether different than other diseases. I think we should look at that experience, see where that actually helped, and see if we could mimic that in a few other cases very carefully. Yeah. Clearly, the other end of the spectrum of access to all for everything is not something that's sustainable.
Can I build on that,
absolutely.
if I might?
And I want to encourage, if there are questions in the audience, I do want to encourage.
I think one of the other things we need is an honest conversation on price, access, and reimbursement. Clearly from the grassroots up, that's bubbling up as one of the most important conversations, and we're not having it in the right way. Mm-hmm. This is an industry that is living in its platinum age, right? We talk about the golden age of technology, the golden age. We're beyond that. This is the platinum age of science, and we don't want to do anything that will minimize or diminish the opportunities that are unfolding just literally by the day. I'm also chairman of the board of CRISPR Therapeutics, and I get to see the power of gene editing as a tool for new therapies. We don't want to stop that. If we have an opportunity to treat sickle cell anemia or muscular dystrophy or any of these horrible diseases for which we don't have any cures, but that conversation has to exist alongside the pricing, the access, and the reimbursement conversation. We've forced the dichotomy and separated the two in an unhelpful way, and if we don't pay attention, we really have to think about how we bring these things together.
How that might stifle. Yes, sir.
So this is Vineet Nijawan from Boston University. The panel's funding the future. Funding the past has really been about the federal government funding the commons, which created what you guys have been talking about. Who's going to fund the future as federal government retreats? Is it philanthropy? Is it pharma R&D? Where's LPs? Where's the money going to come from that's going to replace $30 billion a year?
I have a point of view, but Noubar, do you want to start?
No, I mean, I think you already gave the answer to the questions. It is already happening. There are, if the system adjusts to the upfront research funding going down, what's going to happen is we're going to have to fill in for that, but then get rewarded for that. So the players who can take late-stage risk are going to have to reward early-stage risk. It used to be 10 years ago that if you had a compound that had no clinical validation, it was worthless. Today, people are doing deals where there's value being placed on early-stage promising compounds. Why? Because it's a reward for people who are now taking even earlier stage risk that the research community is not getting funding for. So I think that the model is adjusting. Philanthropy is stepping in and creating a pull force for some of these. So I think we're seeing it playing out in front of us. Clearly, there's going to be less kind of support if the funding dries up upstream, and therefore there'll be a narrowing of the kind of things we could do, we have done, which concerns us, but I think the industry is going to start adjusting to it.
Gilmore, you have a thought about that?
I actually agree 100% with what you're saying, and we actually have seen it. We have seen the philanthropic organizations stepping in, the amount of resource, and not only resource, but expertise that they're bringing to bear is huge. I think you actually also described the increasing networking and sharing of risk. Essentially, the risk pool, if you will, of innovation is the thing that's actually expanding hugely. And so I fully agree with you. And I think what we're actually seeing in the end is that industry is adaptive and will adapt, is being forced to adapt and will adapt to this change in the early funding environment.
Another question here.
Good morning. My name is Lynn Nicholas, and I'm the president and CEO of the Massachusetts Health and Hospital Association. So I'm really glad that you raised the issue of access, price, and reimbursement. And my question is around the fact that Massachusetts uniquely has a healthcare cost trend goal for total medical expense. And we've been under that goal for several years, and then last year we blew it. Mass health enrollment was one, but the other big issue was pharma, the cost of pharma. So I'm wondering if you feel that there is a responsibility for the industry to work to help mitigate that cost trend so that we can stand our goal. And if you have any thoughts about how providers, government, and the pharmaceutical industry might work together to do that, since we're all being held accountable, and me especially, for that goal.
So I thank you for the question, because it is timely, and this could be the beginning of that conversation that we talked about a moment ago. A couple of things. One, I think the industry has a responsibility, a citizenship and a stewardship responsibility to price responsibly. Simply put, that lays no value on how high or how low, but to price responsibly. I do think we should nuance also the notion that there is the science-based industry and there is the commodity-based side of the industry as well. And they really should be treated differently. We've had several very high-profile examples on the commodity side of this industry where prices have been raised inexplicably, and that has really hurt the science-based side of the industry. And we have to have a real conversation, a real understanding that they're radically different. If you're spending $2.6 billion, or let's say it's $2 billion, on the science-based side of the industry, discovering new therapies, taking advantage of that platinum age in science, and you're spending $1 million on the commodity industry side, something's out of whack, and they shouldn't be lumped together. I think my colleague, the CEO of Regeneron, Len Schleifer, got it right when he recently said publicly, we should think less about how big the price increases are and where we price at the beginning of the launch of a particular therapy. Meeting particular goals through double-digit price increases is not sustainable. And we've got to rethink the equation and the formula for value and really come back to something that one of my great heroes in this industry, Roy Vagelos, did, which was to stand up and in 1992, when we had the same conversation, say we will not raise price beyond CPI +1. So that moderated the price increases, having nothing to do with the price, but the price increases over a period of time. And we've got to tease that conversation apart as well. So thanks for the question.
All right, they tell me that we are out of time. I appreciate all this, and I know people have other questions as well, so I'm very sorry that we aren't able to get to all of them, but thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.